The recording of that first transmission was played in every world capital within 6 hours. Behind closed doors, leaders sat across from generals and scientists and said the same things in different languages. What does it mean? What is it warning us about? And are we already too late? The questions were unanswerable, but they could not be ignored. Over the following days, as the ship's systems were studied with increasing urgency, the picture that emerged was both extraordinary and deeply troubling. This was not a scout vessel or probe. It was a warship, one of immense sophistication, carrying weapons technology so advanced that humanity's finest engineers could barely understand the basic operating principles, let alone replicate them. Energy cannons that could focus plasma into beams of continent-scarring power. Defensive shields that generated fields capable of deflecting kinetic and energy weapons alike. A propulsion system that, if the readings were correct, could accelerate a vessel to a significant fraction of the speed of light. But the AI, which the team had begun to call Lumen, quietly at first, then officially, was the most extraordinary thing of all. As the days passed, its transmissions became clearer, its language more coherent, as if it was learning from them even as they tried to learn from it. It absorbed the team communication patterns, their linguistic structures, the rhythm of their speech. Within 72 hours, its voice was clean and precise, its words no longer broken by static. What it told them was not comforting. I am the last operational intelligence of a civilization you would not have a name for, it said one evening, when the desert had gone dark and the floodlights cast long shadows across the sand. My creators built me to carry their most important weapon and to find a world capable of using it. They chose this world. But in choosing it, I have done something I was designed to prevent. What have you done? Elena asked. I have led them here. The silence that followed that statement lasted a very long time. Lumen explained, in the measured tone of a being that had processed grief long enough to deliver it calmly, what had happened. Its creators, a civilization millions of years old, had been fleeing, not retreating in defeat, but running from something that even they, with all their ancient power, could not destroy. A force, an entity, a fleet. Lumen's language became frustratingly imprecise on this point. Something that consumed civilizations the way fire consumes paper. Patient, relentless, hungry, the ship had been sent ahead as a last resort. If it could find a world with sufficient spirit, Lumen used that word, spirit, and no one was entirely sure what it meant. The weapon might be enough. The weapon might turn the tide. But the ship's navigation had failed. Its crash had not been an accident so much as a wound. It had been struck during the journey, damaged, and had limped to the nearest habitable world it could reach. And in powering up, even partially, it had broadcast a signal. A beacon. They tracked the weapon, Lumen said. Wherever it goes, they follow. I knew this when I came. I believe I had enough time to prepare you. I was wrong. How much time do we have? General Marcus Cole asked. He was the highest-ranking military officer on site, a man who had spent 30 years cultivating the ability to ask terrible questions without flinching. Less than I would have liked, Lumen said. And then the satellites saw them. They appeared first as anomalies in deep space tracking data, gravitational distortions where there should have been nothing, heat signatures blooming at the edge of the solar system like dark flowers. Then, as they drew closer, they resolved into shapes. Ships, dozens of them, then hundreds, arranged in formations that suggested not just military precision but something closer to ritual, as though their movement itself was a statement, a language written in the mathematics of destruction. They were nothing like Lumen's vessel. Where Lumen's ship had been elegant, even in its ruin, these ships were brutal, angular, massive, and entirely indifferent to beauty. They moved through space without grace, because grace implied an audience whose approval was desired. These things desired nothing so human as approval. Panic arrived on Earth the way it always does, first as rumor, then as report, then as undeniable, screen-filling, everywhere at once reality. Governments issued statements. Markets collapsed. People gathered in streets not knowing what they were gathering for, only that they needed to be near other people. Religious leaders spoke. Scientists spoke. Politicians spoke. None of them said anything that helped. In the desert, Elena stood in front of Lumen's core and asked a question that no one in any Capitol building had yet managed to articulate properly. Can we actually win? Lumen was quiet for a moment, a long moment. long enough that Elena wondered if it was choosing its words or deciding whether to lie. The weapon was designed to destroy their command structure. It said at last, if it reaches critical discharge proximity to their flagship, the resulting cascade will disable the fleet. They will not be able to recover quickly. It is not a permanent solution, but it is a window. A window for what? For whatever comes next. I cannot see that far. Neither can you, but a window is more than you had yesterday. The decision to activate the ship's full systems was made by a council of 12 world leaders in a bunker beneath the Swiss Alps, relayed to the desert team at 3 a.m. It was not a unanimous decision. 3 leaders voted against it, arguing that engaging the alien fleet on its own terms was suicide. They were outvoted by those who recognized that the only alternative was to do nothing and wait for the end. The activation sequence took 4 hours. Lumen guided it, patient and precise, walking the engineering team through each step with a calm that was either reassuring or deeply eerie depending on who you asked. The ship groaned as power flooded back into its damaged systems. Lights blazed across its hull. The geometric patterns etched into its surface began to glow. Gold, then white, then a blue so intense it hurt to look at directly. And then it rose. Not dramatically, not with a roar of conventional engines. It simply lifted, the ship that had been half buried in desert sand for days rising with a low, sustained harmonic resonance that made the sand beneath it turn to glass. It ascended through the atmosphere with the measured certainty of something that had always known it would rise again, and took its position above the clouds, hanging there like a second moon. Humanity's own fleet, every combat-capable spacecraft that could be launched, supplemented by armed orbital platforms, and every directed energy weapon that could be angled upward, arranged itself in formation around the alien warship. They were flies flanking an eagle, but they were there. Elena was aboard. She had refused to remain on the ground. No one had tried very hard to stop her. She stood in the chamber with Lumen's core, watching the battle screens that Lumen had configured specifically for human eyes, a translated, comprehensible rendering of the chaos unfolding beyond the atmosphere. The enemy fleet filled the upper left quadrant of every display, a dark mass of angular ships converging with horrible inevitability. They will attempt to disable me first, Lumen said. They know what I carry. They have always known. Then we protect you, Elena said. Yes. Lumen. She hesitated. Why did you choose us? You said your creators chose this world. But why? We're not ready for this. Another pause. When Lumen spoke, something had shifted in its voice, something that might, in a human, have been called tenderness. No species ever is, it said. But your world has something my creators once had. Before they had it for so long they forgot what it felt like. You are afraid, and you are fighting anyway. That is the only qualification that has ever mattered. The battle began without ceremony. The enemy fleet split into 3 columns and accelerated simultaneously, their weapons opening fire before they were fully within range, a psychological tactic as much as a military one, filling the sky with light and sound, overwhelming the senses, inducing paralysis through spectacle. It might have worked against a purely human defense. But Lumen was already moving. The warship swept forward with breathtaking speed, placing itself between the incoming fleet and Earth's atmosphere, and discharged its primary cannon for the first time. The beam it produced was not visible in any conventional sense. It was a concentrated disruption of space itself, a fold in the fabric of reality that passed through the lead enemy ships like a thought-through paper. 3 of their largest vessels simply ceased to hold their shape. They came apart in expanding clouds of debris that scattered across the battle space like broken teeth. The enemy adapted immediately. Their formation shifted, dispersing to reduce concentrated targeting solutions. They were old at this, ancient at it, in ways that Lumen creators had not been able to overcome. They had been destroying civilization for longer than humanity had been building fire. The human fleet engaged with everything it had. Missiles, railgun projectiles, energy weapons. They filled the void with light and fury, and some of it connected, and some of those connections punched through shielding and drew blood, or whatever passed the blood in the mechanisms of these ships. But the losses were catastrophic. Human vessels vanished from the tactical display one by one, then in clusters, overwhelmed by firepower that their armor was never designed to absorb. Elena watched it all without looking away. She owed the dead that much. They are concentrating on my propulsion array, Lumen reported, still calm, always calm. I am sustaining damage. My firing solution for the flagship will be available in 11 minutes. Can you hold for 11 minutes? I am calculating the probability. Don't calculate it. Just do it. A pause. Yes. What followed was 11 minutes that would be remembered in every language humans would speak for the rest of their history, as the longest 11 minutes ever lived. Lumen wove through the enemy formation with a fluid, inhuman precision, taking hits that would have destroyed any human vessel 10 times over, absorbing them, redistributing the damage, protecting its core at the cost of everything else. Whole sections of its hull burned away. Its defensive shields flickered and collapsed in sections. The glow of its geometric patterns dimmed as power was routed from aesthetics to survival. But it kept moving, and it kept firing. And the enemy fleet, vast and terrible as it was, could not quite close the distance to the weapon at its heart. Elena found herself talking to Lumen during those 11 minutes. Not giving orders or asking for data, just talking, telling it about the world below them, the deserts and the oceans, the cities lit up at night like scattered handfuls of stars, the sound of music drifting from an open window, the particular quality of light on a winter morning. She did not know why she was telling it these things. She only knew that it was listening. Firing solution acquired, Lumen said. Initiating. What happened next was witnessed by every satellite still in orbit, every telescope still pointed skyward, every human being on the night side of the planet who happened to look up at the right moment. A light appeared above the atmosphere, not the explosive, aggressive light of combat, but something else entirely, something that expanded slowly in all directions at once, a pulse of energy that had no color and every color simultaneously, a wave that moved outward from the alien warship's position and passed through the enemy fleet like a hand sweeping pieces from a board. It did not destroy them. Not exactly. It unraveled them, disrupted the coherent systems that held their technology functional, collapsed the field generators that kept their weapons charged, severed the communication architecture that bound their fleet into a single coordinated intelligence. In an instant, hundreds of vessels went dark and silent, drifting without purpose through the space above a planet they had come to end. Lumen's ship, at the center of the discharge, was destroyed entirely. The shockwave dismantled it in a fraction of a second. There was no explosion, no dramatic fireball. It simply ceased to be where it had been, replaced by an expanding sphere of crystalline particles that caught the light of the sun and scattered it into a brief, breathtaking aurora that was visible from the surface below. In the aftermath, Elena was found floating in an emergency pod that Lumen had, without telling her, sealed and launched 4 to 5 seconds before the final discharge. She did not remember being moved. She did not remember the seams of the pod closing around her. She had been talking about winterlight, and then she had been here, drifting safely in orbit, watching the auroras paint themselves across the top of the sky. The enemy fleet drifted, dark and powerless, for 3 days before the decisions about what to do with them had to be made. It was the easiest 3 days humanity had ever spent, and somehow the heaviest. The questions that followed the battle were larger than the battle itself. What were the drifting ships? Could they be studied? Should they be? Were there living beings inside them, beings that, without their fleet's infrastructure, might be no more capable of harm than a tiger with a broken spine? And if so, what did humanity owe them? What had Lumen creators been like? Where were they now? Still running, or already gone? Would others of their kind come? Would the enemy recover and return in force? Or had the disruption been severe enough to buy humanity the window Lumen had promised? And the deepest question of all, the one that Elena wrote in her journal on the night they brought her home, sitting at her desk with a cup of cold coffee in the first silence she had known in weeks. What does it mean to be chosen? Not as a compliment, not as a flattery, but as a fact, cold and strange and new. Some other civilization, impossibly ancient, impossibly wise, impossibly afraid, had looked across the darkness of the cosmos and found this small, loud, beautiful, violent, tender, terrified species clinging to a blue-green rock in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy, and had decided that whatever fire burned in human beings, that particular combustion of fear and defiance, of grief and hope, of the willingness to stand in the dark with broken weapons and fight anyway, was worth passing the torch to. Lumen was gone. Its voice was gone. The core that had pulsed with something almost like feeling was scattered across the upper atmosphere, its particles raining down silently on every continent, every ocean, dissolving into the world they had helped to save. But it had left something behind. Not in any of the alien technology that the engineering teams would spend years cataloging. Not in the data recovered from the wreckage of the enemy's ships. Something less tangible and more permanent than any of that. It had left behind the knowledge of what humanity was capable of, reflected back at them from something that had seen 1,000 civilizations rise and fall, and still believed that one more was worth the cost of a ship, the cost of a war, the cost of everything. The window was open. What they built in it, what they chose to become in the long, strange, terrifying years of a galaxy that now knew their name, that was a story that had not yet been written, but it had begun, and in the beginning, there had been a quiet desert night, and a crack of fire across the sky, and the sound of something trying very hard to reach them before it was too late. It had made it. Barely. But barely, as it turned out, was enough. The desert had never been louder than the moment it fell silent. It was nearly midnight when the sky cracked open. A streak of fire carved through the darkness like a wound, moving too fast, burning too bright, trailing a plume of ionized gas that turned the stars around it a sickly violet. Then came the impact, a thunderous collision that shook the earth for 200 miles in every direction. Sand blasted outward in a perfect ring. Rock formations that had stood for 10,000 years crumbled in an instant. The sound rolled across the wasteland like the voice of something ancient and furious, echoing off canyon walls long after the object itself had come to rest. Then silence, a silence so total, so unnatural, that even the wind seemed afraid to return. Within 12 minutes, military satellites had already triangulated the impact zone. Within 30, signals intelligence teams across 3 continents were decoding the thermal signatures streaming in from orbit. Within an hour, every major news network on Earth had interrupted its regular broadcast with the same 2 words, spoken in dozens of languages, each carrying the same trembling weight. Something crashed. But this was not a meteorite. The shape was wrong. The density was wrong. The thermal decay pattern was unlike any space rock ever recorded. Whatever had fallen from the sky had not been drifting aimlessly through the cosmos. It had been traveling with purpose, decelerating before impact, trying, in its final moments, to land. It had simply failed. By dawn, a perimeter of military vehicles stretched across the desert floor for half a mile. Black helicopters circled overhead like patient vultures. Floodlights turned the crash site into a pale, artificial noon. And at the center of it all lay the wreckage, a colossal, broken thing half buried in the scorched earth, its hull twisted and blackened, its surface covered in geometric patterns that seemed to shift subtly depending on the angle of light. It was massive, larger than a football stadium, shaped, at least partially, like something that had once been elegant, a vessel designed for speed and grace, now reduced to a carcass of cooling metal and silence. Dr. Elena Vasquez was among the first civilian scientists to arrive at the site. She stood at the edge of the inner perimeter, her coat pulled tight against the pre-dawn chill, and stared at the wreckage with the expression of someone trying very hard to remain rational while every instinct screamed that rationality no longer applied. "There's no way a meteor does this," she murmured to the engineer beside her, Dr. James Okafor. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. They both already knew. The structural analysis teams moved in carefully, their instruments scanning, measuring, cataloging. Every reading came back strange. The alloy composition of the hull did not match any known element. Some of the molecular structures seemed physically impossible, materials that should not have been able to maintain coherence at standard atmospheric pressure, and yet did so with perfect stability. The geometry of the ship's internal framework defied conventional aerospace engineering, and yet it all held together, even in ruin, as if the very act of destruction had been factored into its design. This ship wasn't just built to fly, Okafor said quietly, staring at a scanner readout. It was built to survive being broken. There were no bodies, no crew, no passengers, no biological remains of any kind. Wherever the ship had come from, it had arrived empty, or at least it appeared that way, until they found the compartment. It was deep in the belly of the wreckage, concealed behind 3 layers of interlocking hull plating that required 4 hours of careful cutting to breach. The compartment was perfectly intact, sealed against the impact as though it had been protected by a separate, more powerful system entirely. The metal around it was warped and destroyed. The compartment itself was flawless. When the seam finally hissed open, releasing a breath of cool, pressurized air that smelled faintly of something no one could name, the team inside went very still. The chamber was small, perhaps 12 feet across. Its walls were covered in dormant screens. At the center, suspended in a framework of crystalline rods that glowed with a faint, pulsing blue light, was a core the size of a car engine, humming at a frequency that seemed to resonate not just in the ears but somewhere deeper, in the chest, behind the eyes, in the quiet space between thoughts. It was alive, not biologically, but alive in the way that a mind is alive, even when it's sleeping. One of the screens flickered, then another, then all of them at once, flooding the chamber with cascading symbols that scrolled too fast for the human eye to follow, alien characters cycling through configurations that somehow felt, despite their total foreignness, like language, like meanings struggling to find shape. Elena stepped forward before anyone could stop her. She raised her scanner toward the pulsing core. The moment a device's signal touched it, the scrolling symbols froze. A voice filled the room. It was low, metallic, and broken, like a transmission clawing its way through decades of static. Each word dropped into the silence like a stone into deep water. We left too soon. Danger, still here.